So our second session features Laila, who has started her career at the White House and Congress, and is the CEO and founder of The Tempest, the leading tech and media company by diverse millennial women for the world. She is also the host for the Expose, a podcast tackling tough topics with snark and wit. In 2016, she was honored at the White House Summit on the United States of Women. Since founding The Tempest, Laila has been quoted in nationwide outlets like the New York Times, The Guardian, and CNN Money as a disruptive force in media. In her previous life, Laila was a researcher here at Princeton, studying socio-cognitive processing under the framework of community identity and belonging. And this session will be moderated by Reina, who I will hand the mic over to.
Well, we're going to go with Laila now.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's true.
Awesome. Thank you. So I figured since it's so intimate, I wouldn't even have a PowerPoint put together. I can tell the future, as you can tell, since I didn't prep it before the event. So. All right, awesome. So I'll start with a few questions first to the audience, since that's my favorite thing to do. How many of you spent a semi-significant period of time looking at your closet and picking out your outfit today? Mine was on Friday, because that's packed, but... Oh, some of you are like, nope, no, I just went with... Okay, how many of you follow the fashion space or can name someone, a fashion influencer that actually defines what you wear?
Influencers.
Yeah, influencers. I'm not asking for you to name them. How many of you adhere to modest fashion? The men aren't raising their hands. And how many of you remember the 90s when it was really difficult to find modest fashion pieces that didn't look like they came from the 1800s? All right. So with that, some of you are really into fashion, modest fashion, and some of you are a little bit, not as into it, so that's an interesting crowd. So I have a personal connection to modest fashion, although I am not a designer. I grew up scouring the shelves of Marshalls and Sears and any store that had some hint of a dress that would go to your knees, or pants that were not skin tight, as my mother liked to say. Just looking for that outfit that didn't look too frumpy. Part of the reason I didn't want to put together a PowerPoint is because I did have some dark moments during my teenage years where I looked like a 30-year-old as a teenager. So I'm sure we all remember pre-blogging, pre-Instagram influencers, pre-fashion influencers overall, where it was really difficult just to find someone that you could look up to, or someone who just had outfits, unless they were a celebrity and were being pictured courtesy of the paparazzi. So actually in 2004, 2005, I was actually thinking, oh, maybe I should start a style site, where I feature some women that have really cool outfits. And that got shot down really quickly because back then it wasn't, at least in my community enclave, it wasn't really considered great to be photographed and placed online, and privacy was a really big deal. So that was, I think I was a little ahead of the time. So modest fashion really hits each of us really personally, whether or not you want to admit it. It's the reason that it hits so personally is because it's affecting what you're wearing on a day-to-day basis, right? And so whenever any news or controversy happens, the reason that the reactions from the community hit on either pure love or pure hate is because we're coming at it from such a personal lens that many of the times it's very difficult to come at it from a less invested perspective, right? So it's really personal. So we've moved away from the 90s and the early 2000s where we had difficulty putting together outfits that weren't frumpy, but we're still in a space right now where modest fashion is seen as Muslim fashion, not necessarily modesty as a whole. And I say this because when I was trying to Google stats for my talk, Google decided that Muslim fashion was what I was looking for, not modest fashion, and I couldn't find any actual stats about how large the modest fashion market was. So That's kind of depressing. So I can tell you how formidable the Muslim fashion market value is, and you'll have to kind of take it out from there in terms of what the general modest fashion market is. The 2015 to 2016 State of Global Islamic Economy report states that our current spending power for Muslims globally is 230 billion for fashion, and that stated is slated to grow to 327 billion in 2019, which is larger than the combined fashion markets of the United Kingdom, which is 107 billion, Germany 99 billion, and India at 97 billion. So consider that for the Muslim fashion market, and then multiply it for the general modest fashion market. It is a massive space, and it's still a very new space in terms of the influencers and creators, and so that's really where the fun can get. It can get really fun or really dirty really quickly. So that's, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the controversy later on with Reina, the different controversies that come up. But so I'm not going to go into specific examples, but I'm sure if you take a moment and you think about it, you can think of at least one controversy that's happened in the modest fashion space in the last few years. Does anyone want to shout out an example? Or not shout out, just whisper.
Mipsters.
Mipsters, yay! That's one. Is there another one? There's one that happened very recently in the Muslim space. Yeah, Notik and Playboy. So those are fun, and they're all bound up in this question of who we believe individually, who do we believe represents us in the modest fashion space. That's really what it boils down to. Regardless of how long you've taken to debate the merits of whether or not Notik should have been interviewed in Playboy, it came down to this understanding that personally you're feeling some type of way because it hits you very close to home, right? So, newsflash, there is no one right person that will ever represent the modest fashion market. I'm sorry if you were hoping for that. We're not in a utopia. And I'll bring it to the Muslim community specifically. If you look at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, we were never told to follow the example of one woman during his time. We were instead given a plethora of women, of his companions, these female companions who ranged anywhere from being extremely quiet and spending their time at home to being out in the field, leading armies, teaching classes, running races with the Prophet. You had all of these different types of women that we were instead given the stories about, and in each of those women we can find either ourselves or we can find someone we know. And so unfortunately, we have such a ripe space right now in terms of the modest fashion market, and I personally think that our time that we spend arguing about these different controversies, these different issues, comes from, in part, our fear of possibility, just the vast amount of possibilities that's out there in terms of the modest fashion space. So it's a reflection of the community's continued work towards understanding plurality. And I'm saying this because even in the past year, I can't even begin to count the number of issues, not even just in the the Muslim modest fashion space, but just in the Muslim space, that come from a lack of recognition that we can actually have differences of opinion, and that's totally chill. That we're not actually going to die if someone has another opinion and you don't agree with their Facebook status. So there's such a space for growth. So how can we best use fashion to create a shift in culture, to create a shift in society? Since fashion, quite literally, is a reflection of where we are in the times that we live in, how we feel about those times. I mean, look at the different cultures and communities that are based around the world. An example I'll just give off the cuff, and I won't go too far into. I'm half Syrian, And the Syrian conflict is currently it's currently happening. And the thing that people don't know is that 60 plus years ago in Syria, women didn't wear the headscarf. And women, it wasn't a common thing. And that as time went on, and as the perception by government and by the community within Syria was that the West was coming to, change the identity of those that were within the country, women started covering more and more, and eventually started wearing the headscarf. So it's really funny because I look back at my grandmother and aunt's photos, and so they'd have short skirts and a headscarf on, because back then they just put it on and they'd have their skirts here, and it was a very interesting time. So, it's this understanding that fashion quite literally reflects where we are emotionally, mentally, socially, culturally, economically. And we have to move away from this mentality, especially in the Muslim community, the modest fashion community as a whole, but also the Muslim modest fashion community. We have to move away from this mentality that there's a very tiny piece of the pie, and that there can only be one who will be able to eat that pie. And the best way to, and really realize that the best way to control what's going on around us is to create, and to create that culture. So this event is a litmus test. I think it's really indicative of the fact that we're recognizing that cultural and fashion trends really influence, the needs of the community, the fashion needs of the community to begin with, and it gives us a good idea of the market opportunities out there. The fact that you guys showed up means that you understand as well that fashion does play an important role in our lives, and that there's a lot of space that we can actually develop in. But we need to move from talk to action and break away from that scarcity complex. And until then, we're really underselling our potential as a community, as individuals, as consumers, and it allows others to profit off of our need in the meantime. Some examples, if you think about all of the controversy or acceptance of the fact that Dolce & Gabbana, not Dolce & Gabbana, but I just put on the perfume this morning, so I'm DKNY, yeah, thank you. My caffeine is not kicked in yet. DKNY created clothing that fit the modest fashion market, and a lot of individuals were either agreeing or disagreeing with the fact that they had done so, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that they capitalized on a need, and that we're sitting here ranting and raving about it or purchasing it, and instead of actually going out and creating it ourselves, right? And so it really comes down to, if you're not creating or if you're not influencing or speaking out about it, then someone else will. And creators and influencers that are currently in the modest fashion space are in their space because they're the ones that are creating and deciding the trends. So regardless of how frustrating it was, for example, to see someone else take your definition of modesty and use it in Playboy, for example, that someone else took the opportunity to do so and did it, right? And so it's moving away from, okay, I'm really frustrated about the fact that that person took it, to how can I ensure that I also take that space and take what space I want in order to be able to influence it as well. Since, at the end of the day, regardless of how you felt about the issue, and this is specifically at the Muslim community, she was able to create conversation that she determined. She actually determined the conversation. She was the one that was able to get the coverage and move use what was going on in the current community, in the current political climate, for personal gain, right? And nobody else did that. So you have to go out, you have to occupy the market space, and if you do that, you're going to be able to drive the definition of what modest fashion actually looks like and the conversation. And like I was telling Reina earlier, there are no gatekeepers yet. There are no solid gatekeepers yet. We don't have the esteemed Ralph Lauren and all of these individuals that are known in the mainstream fashion market space, they're not yet established in the modest fashion space. You have some bloggers here and there, you have some influencers here and there that are starting to get a foothold, but that's the whole point. They're starting to get a foothold, and so it's really ripe for individuals to start and actually get into the game. So there's always an opportunity to create, and if you take that, if you actually go through, you take that time and that space to create and to create action, you'll be able to influence and kind of take over the modest fashion market. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Laila. And I'm going to take us through a few discussion points before we return again to contributions and questions from the floor. And of course, over the course of the afternoon, the conversation is building and recycling and rotating from previous points. And I'm going to go back to your point about gatekeepers, because I think of gatekeepers, it sounds to me like when you're saying gatekeepers, you're talking both about those who police the gates, but also those who are understood to be authorities. And it seems you're talking about it in terms of style and also in terms of judgment. And I think what's very interesting in terms of modest fashion is that I do see designers and creative entrepreneurs, some of whom we have with us here today, and bloggers who we also have with us here today, and those on social media who have attained really significant status as influencers and tastemakers and guides within the modest fashion community, if we can call it that, but it's whether they're recognized externally. So do you think that the A-list within modest fashion, within the Muslim modest fashion sector and in other faiths and cross-faiths, are they going to start to get play if the market is now waking up, the mainstream fashion market is now waking up to the Muslim spend on fashion, as you said, as we discussed previously, and also that from other faith groups? Is that also going to create an opportunity for people in fashion media too?
So just to ensure that I got your question right, you were specifically asking, once these modest fashion influencers, bloggers, and creators get that recognition and that space from the mainstream fashion market, are we also going to have change there, and are we also going to be able to create space for fashion media? Is that
for fashion media? Are people going to get recognition within the mainstream fashion industry, both in terms of design and also in terms of fashion media? Do you think those two things are going to develop, so both commerce and commentary, and that people who started from religious communities are going to find themselves having more career options then?
Well, I think there's a lot of emphasis around getting opportunities as opposed to taking opportunities. And the reason that I say this is I run a media company, and our focus really is on diverse millennial women, which sounds like there is no focus because diverse can really mean anything, right? And that's the whole point. But we've really been able to, within that space, create influencers and thought leaders simply by opening up the venue and letting people take opportunities, right? And so I think something that especially happens when it comes to women is that we're always waiting for someone to allow us that opportunity. And that's why when you look at the larger fashion market, a lot of the individuals, the photographers, the designers, the bloggers, look at the sartorialist, look at these individuals are mostly men that have been offering individuals opportunities, right? And so when it comes to modest fashion, and when I say modest fashion, I really mean every religion within that. I'm hoping we become a larger community, but we're not. I also hope for a utopia. We're not in that. So when it comes to these different faith groups that are now being recognized and being offered opportunities at exposure from the larger fashion space, it always comes at a cost of whether or not the climate is perceived to be right? And so even when it comes to Muslim fashion, suddenly being recognized by the open, the larger fashion space, it's still recognized in the framework of Middle Eastern fashion. it's not recognized in the framework of American Muslim fashion. It's not recognized in the framework of South Asian fashion. It's recognized in a very specific, narrow framework. And so part of that, you know, comes from this lack of individuals simply going out and developing their own opportunities, not waiting for someone to hand them, you know, hand them the golden ticket, and instead just walk into events and say, listen, you know, this is where I am, this is my commentary, and I'm determined to make that space. So you can really create that demand if you know that there is that demand and you keep repeating it, and then that's where you can really decide whether or not, you know, how to take that.
So would you then say that Hannah Tajima's collaboration with Uniqlo was an unusual success story, in that that is somebody working with one of the mainstream brands? And although that started out retailing for the first collection only in Southeast Asia, obviously it went viral immediately online. So the images traveled even if the product didn't. And then, you know, the second collection, I could go look at it in Oxford Street in the flagship store in London. So is that an example of a success story?
Absolutely, and I think it's also an example of a larger fashion, you know, gatekeeper, essentially, Uniqlo, understanding the value of what she's bringing, as well as the size of the consumer market, right? So I don't think that it's a unique success story, primarily because I believe that there are a lot of up and coming modest fashion designers that are beginning to have their collections showcased by other, or they're on their way to have those conversations. And so I think that it's simply, she was ahead of the game, and I'm hopeful that that is not an anomaly, that we'll see more of it to come.
So she went from being a niche online designer in, I know it's a young market, but in what I would call the early stages.
Yeah.
She was one of the first with a niche online brand that then did have this crossover, and specifically a crossover that wasn't marketed as only being for modest dressers, Muslim or otherwise. I want to go back to the point you made about the constant moral panics, about what Muslims look like or what people from other religious communities look like, but particularly Muslims, because I was very struck by you saying, you know, the Muslim community or Muslim communities plural need to learn or are struggling to come to terms with multiplicity, with the different ways. And if we think back to the Mixters video in 2014, because you wrote so cogently about that, Laila, and for anyone unaware of it, it was a video brought out in 2014 of a short film of a group of young women in hijab grooving and playing around in public spaces to a Jay-Z music sound. Was it Jay-Z? Yeah, Jay-Z music soundtrack. And I saw it, and I thought, oh, this is great, I know these girls, you know, look like people I knew. And it caused an enormous storm within sections of the Muslim community. And I had Muslims, and sometimes young Muslim men, saying to me, the community is really unhappy about this, as if the community was a single thing, first of all. And for me, that's another sort of gatekeeping. Now, that was in 2014, and you said that there was a lot of airspace being taken up with Muslims fuming and being anxious about this as the wrong representation of Muslim women. And that's also partly, not just, I think, about people's personal preferences, but about in a media world where there are very few images of Muslim women, therefore there is the scarcity of images, and so the politics comes into it there. So if this is going to be one of the few, this is the wrong one. But what you said, which I loved, was this silence is perpetuated in the lack of space given to Muslim women in the public sphere. It's a reality underscored time and again at each mega convention and town hall event. Speaker after speaker is male, and the rare Muslim woman allowed to speak only if she fits an unspoken mold of what Muslim women should look like or act like. That was 2014. Has it changed?
I wish. I think that we've started to get a little bit more comfortable with differences, or at least I hope. But the reality is that we're still having conversations about very inane details around people's decisions to do this thing or that thing. You know, when the Mipsters video first came out, I thought it was amazing, you know, and personally, because I was really jealous. I really wanted to be in the video, you know, and I thought they looked so cool doing what they did, but there was just this, it goes back to this scarcity complex, and frankly, I don't think that we have moved into a space where we understand that there is space for more than one group of individuals to be heard. I think that part of that, it happens specifically during this election season, right? Where you had specific Muslim women who fit a specific look being asked and being given the space to be heard, while a lot of women are still not being given that space to be heard. And when I say look a certain type of way, I mean women who generally wear the headscarf, generally dress either fashionably, you know, breaking stereotypes, or more modestly, you know, the conventional Muslim women. And so it's a constant struggle, and I always love it when men comment on Muslim women and where we fit in, because, I mean, they've been able to do what they wanted to do for how many hundreds of years, and they're still doing it, and they're still deciding whether or not we fit in. So whenever young Muslim men, you know, my age, try to insert their commentary, I just, you know, comment on their Facebook status and tell them to please just shut up and get to finding a job, since they're spending way too much time in front of the computer looking at these videos. So
I think you comment in no uncertain terms as well, but we won't use that language here today. I want to go back to social media because, you know, we were talking previously about the election result this week with Donald Trump winning and now being your president-elect. And this was a very difficult moment for very many people, and I was watching your Twitter feed on the day before and on election night and the day after, and it seemed on your feed, as in other social media commentary, that there was a very clear understanding of the intersection of racism, anti-Muslim prejudice, misogyny, queer hating, and you wrote about that you grieved for the lost innocence of so many people who thought that they were going to get a result that they wanted and now aren't. And I was also struck by the variety of, in as much as you can tell online, the variety of people who are allies and voices in that shared community, and also your intersections with different conversations. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you sustain those conversations, sometimes with people you don't agree with 100%, and what you think you might take from that also moving forward.
Yeah, the election night was definitely extremely eye-opening for a lot of different reasons. And, you know, I think for me, if I'm not actually as, a lot of people have been extremely numb and have had to take off work and take that time to grieve and to heal. And I think I moved from denial to fury pretty quickly, and then hence the expletive-laden tweets that you didn't mention. But you know, my parents would be so proud of me right now. But you know, the interesting thing is that when it comes to a lot of the commentary that took place around his win post-election, there wasn't very much conversation that I saw within my within the silos that I'm in and the silos that we're all in, where we attempted to talk to the other side, meaning Trump supporters, right? And so one thing that I've been really fortunate to have on Twitter has been a very wide network of individuals who have spoken up or have gotten in touch with me, and we've been able to develop relationships. And one of them is actually a very ardent Trump supporter. He's actually one of my closest friends on Twitter, and he has my Twitter account favorited, so he actually retweets and comments on almost every tweet that comes through my feed. So people actually think he's a robot because he's so fast. And I remember the week before the election, he messaged me and he said, you know, and this is a man who's in his 50s, who is white, who lives in Wisconsin, who's a Packers fan. And I know this because his Twitter handle is quite literally Wiz Sports Fan. And he messaged me, he said, listen, you know, I'm going to vote for Trump. Are we still going to be friends after this? And, you know, I told him that while I was really disappointed to hear that, I respected his decision and, you know, his support. Like, our friendship wouldn't be affected by that, which a lot of people might be thinking right now, well, that's ridiculous. You should have, you know, you should have told him that your friendship would end if he had gone and voted for Trump, or you should have, you know, schooled him on why that was wrong. The reality is I was already doing that. My Twitter feed is pretty, when I do speak out, it's usually about social justice issues or about things that are happening with my company. And, you know, he knows me from a more personal perspective because of the fact that we've been friends on Twitter. I allowed him to be followed back by me in 2014 because I thought it was a creepy white dude following me for a while. But, you know, this man has actually stood up for me against Trump, ridiculous alt-right and Trump supporters that have attacked me. And he is probably the first person who will respond to someone attacking me on Twitter. And I think that's something that we kind of lose sight of, is that allies are not always people that you are in full agreement with, as unfortunate as that is. And, you know, he's been checking in on me every day since the election and has told me that he has not been celebrating the election outwardly because of the fact that he knows how much it affects myself and my people like me. And so I think that's something that we forget, is that the elections were extremely isolating for a lot of us, but that there are still, as horrible as it is, there are still people on the other side that are sane, even though I still wish he hadn't voted for Trump. So.
I'm going to switch tack slightly,
Yes.
and go back to something we talked about in the first session as well, which is about coming to college and the different pressure put on men and women about dressing and behaving modestly. And I thought it was interesting that when you asked in your intro, you know, who dresses modestly, and none of the guys put up their hands, although of course, you know, religions who have codes and sources about modest dressing often also have requirements on men to dress and behave modestly, but we know that very often it's women that bear the burden for that, just as women often bear the burden for preserving and transmitting community and ethnic cultures, and the way in which that's highlighted and recharged in diaspora situations. And in the previous session, Whitney was talking a little bit about some of her experiences at school and at college. So I wanted to ask you, you wrote a really interesting post about the Muslim dating scene and the online dating scene, and I was thinking, online and offline, what role does fashion play and dress in the young Muslim dating scene these days? So do women going to college dress in certain ways, partly because it's sending signals to potential life partners about the types of families that they might want to have, something that some Orthodox Jewish women in retrospect have said to me, we didn't think it at the time, but what I realized I was doing then now. And if I think, for example, I might walk down the street in London and see a woman wearing an abaya, possibly even with a niqab, and the man she's with, who I don't know whether he's related to her, but he's walking with her, is wearing jeans and an Arsenal shirt, and probably doesn't have a beard. So there's nothing about him that marks him. He might be ethnically marked by the colour of his skin. So is there an uneven burden on women to signify both religious status and modesty? And how does that factor then in the dating scene?
That's a really interesting conclusion that you drew from my Muslim dating article. So thank you for pulling that together. I know that in college I was hyper active in finding a life partner. I went to an all-women's college. I went to actually Hillary's alma mater, Wellesley College, and you know, we're known for, the women there are known either for having really good game or no game at all, and so I made sure I was on the right side of history. I'm kidding. But you know, when it comes to dress and to the way that, you know, as you framed it, we signal to our potential life partners. I've never actually thought about it that way.
Might not
just
be
like
the
this.
case.
Yeah, and of course I can only speak from my personal experience and conversations I've had with people in my circles, so I'm not going to make a sweeping statement for the Muslim American community or for Muslim American millennials or Muslim American millennial women. But honestly, you know, when I was going to college, I and my friends would spend a lot of time figuring out what outfits we were going to wear, simply because, you know, the one thing that people talk about when it comes to fashion and when it comes to bodybuilding is that bodybuilding for men is a way to compete with men, right? Even though women think that it's for them. And when it comes to fashion, a lot of times it's a way to compete with other women. And that's literally what it was for us in college, is that we had to show up to the MSA event, which is, you know, Muslim Student Association. So we're from Wellesley, and we would go into Boston, and there would be a much larger event at Harvard, for example, but we had to make sure we looked the hottest, because the girls at the other schools always had some sort of vendetta against Wellesley. Don't know why. Maybe because we make potential presidents, but you know, just throwing shade. But you know, I don't think that I don't think that my dress affected the way that I found partners. I think it was more the way that you interacted with them, and whether or not it was a limitation that you placed upon yourself, because I had friends who were very open to going and speaking to the opposite sex. Others were not open to it at all, and it wasn't reflected in the way that they were dressed in the least, actually. And that's what's fascinating, is that you will see women who wear niqab, who are, you know, cozying up to men at certain events, and you'll see women who don't wear a headscarf and might be deemed very American looking, not talking to any men at all. So.
Thank you. And yes, people often think that women dress for men, and I think bodybuilding is a good comparative example, because very often clothing is a language that women understand in each other. And so yeah, that's a really interesting point, and again something that came up in the previous session. I want to talk a little bit about how continued moral panics that center on items of clothing, often Muslim women's clothing, can often lead members of that community, as well as their allies and supporters, in a position of needing to defend the most orthodox, even when it's not a practice. So defending the right of women in France to wear an abaya or a burqa, even from Muslims who don't consider it necessary or even advisable, or defending the right of women, co-religionists, to wear a bikini from women who don't consider that necessary or advisable. To some extent, does it put people on the back foot, and does it allow more orthodox or more spectacular practices to come to define wider understandings of what Muslim practice is? And does that then feed into the difficulty of understanding diversity and multiplicity within the community? Was that too badly wrapped up?
No, it's not. You're fantastic at asking questions. I'm always trying to figure out when the question starts so I can prepare myself. Can you rephrase it?
Yeah.
I'm just going to be honest.
No. If of necessity, Muslims and others have to be in response mode.
Yeah.
Yet another ban on bikinis, yet another ban on burqas, or schoolgirls can't wear this or that. It also means that sets the agenda. And does the need to having to defend that agenda, which is often defending the practices that many other people would find more orthodox or not necessary, or it's a minority practice demographically, does that keep people on the back foot, and does that also then make it harder to allow for diversity, because that becomes definitional.
Thank you. Yes, I do. My sanity does come from caffeine, and unfortunately, the shots have not kicked in yet. So, thank you for reiterating the question. The reality is when you're on the defensive about an issue, you're always going to be on the defensive, and it doesn't allow for space to move forward. It doesn't allow for space for actual, not even space, but space that isn't artificially created, that isn't created in a form of defiance, but really space that's natural and organic and allows us to have real conversations as opposed to, you know, defiant expressions of within that moment. So I do think that, you know, with the burkini ban, for example, I was on NPR debating Asra Namani and some other individuals, and you know, one thing that kept being brought up by her and that I had to keep defending was the fact that, you know, she kept stating the burkini is the burqa, and I said the burqa is not the burkini, and you know, you have Nigella Lawson, who is not a Muslim, wearing the burkini, and the first time I got hit on was when I wore a burkini, so it's obviously not a sign of orthodoxy. And it was a very frumpy burkini, by the way. So, you know, I think that when we continue to subject ourselves to only have conversations when we're being placed on the defensive or on, you know, in this, it's kind of like when it comes to election season, right? So every 4 years, the year of the election, everyone decides that it's time for a revolution. And then 2 weeks before, even more people decide that it's time for revolution, it's time to protest. And then we forget about it until 3 years down the line when the president's, the election cycle starts all over again. And I don't mean everybody, but I mean the vast majority of citizens who are participating in these conversations. I think the same thing can be said for these kinds of conversations, because we're not really allowing for creative expression to flourish, because we're always on, we're only responding when we're on the defensive.
And that takes up the airtime.
Yeah.
I have one more conversation point, or should we?
That's fine.
Yeah. So you, sort of following on from that, really, you wrote a really great piece about getting beyond tokenism, and you talked about the problem with the first hijabi to be doing anything, you know. And one of the things that you, and I'm noticing that we're speaking about this just a couple of weeks after Sana Hamza was the first recruit to the military college at Norwich University to be allowed to wear a hijab as part of her military uniform whilst training. So there's a constant sequence of the first woman in a hijab to do this, that or other, the first hijabi. And you pointed out that the problem of being first, the danger behind being the token hijabi, is that it tends for the Muslim American community to conflate being the first hijabi with being the first Muslim woman, and that this therefore further invisibilizes the achievements of Muslim women who are not wearing hijab, which further normatizes the hijab as the identifier, and that also more broadly, the emphasis on trailblazers in hijab can disproportionately privilege religion as both a marker of success or a reason for failure. So it's anti-Muslim prejudice against women wearing hijab that is the reason why Muslims across the country are failing to achieve. And I thought that was incredibly interesting. And is that something that you think still applies?
I have a new hashtag for it. It's hashtag Muslim mediocrity. And also my favorite one is hashtag Muslim male mediocrity, but that's a side note. So when it comes to sorry guys, I love men, but sometimes I don't. So when it comes to, it's also fitting because I'm at altMuslimah, so it's a feminist conference. Asma's giving me a look. So, you know, when I wrote that piece, there was a lot of conversation around certain individuals in the community that were being perceived as the first. And it struck a chord in myself and a lot of individuals that I was having conversations with, because it quite literally silenced those women that were working for years to get to the same, if not higher position, weren't wearing the headscarf, or maybe weren't traditionally identifying as Muslim, and suddenly their identities were being erased. You know, I think there's a difference. You brought up the woman who was the first to be allowed to wear the headscarf at the military academy. There's a difference between women who, you know, that example I don't see as
It's an intervention.
yeah, I don't see that as, you know, being the first, but really just she got in, she worked her butt off to get into where, you know, that academy, and then she lobbied to make sure that she would have the ability to continue practicing her faith. I don't think that that is, you know, if she had not been allowed to do it, that, well, actually we probably would have heard about it, but it wasn't packaged that her headscarf was the reason why she was accepted into the academy. And so the issue is when we start packaging it as the reason that you got into so-and-so space, or the reason that it's not you, it's never you. It's the reason I got into this space is because I wear the headscarf, and I speak for Muslim women, and I speak for the Muslim community, and I am the token. The individuals that tokenize themselves quite literally tokenize themselves. And so when you do that, you're immediately stripping everyone else of that ability to, you know, reach that level. And it delegitimizes, and it's still happening. I mean, your question, you asked if it's still happening. It's still happening. I mean, when we look at someone, and I brought her up in my article when I wrote about it, when you look at someone as incredible as Ibtihaj Muhammad, right? You know, she's the first American Olympian who wore the headscarf. She was not the only Muslim woman Olympian in the American team, but we didn't find out about Delilah until she took a picture with Ibtihaj, and because she didn't wear a headscarf. So Ibtihaj, you know, for better or for worse, got a lot of press attention, and she's incredible at her game. That's exactly why she got into the Olympics. But we literally stripped another woman of her incredible accomplishments because of the fact that we were so focused on the fact that there was the first, and it was the first Muslim woman. It wasn't the first, you know, Ibtihaj tried to steer the conversation into a more empowering, you know, everyone has a chance at this, but unfortunately her narrative kept being taken away from her when it came to Muslim media outlets covering it. And, you know, I think that's actually disempowering to those who have worked to get to that position. I think that there is an unnecessary amount of pressure for individuals who have actually worked and gotten into a role based off of merit, based off of networking, based off of whatever it is that they got, you know, that they took to get into that role, and then suddenly we say it's because, you know, we lay our claim to it, and we say it's because she's Muslim, it's because she wears a headscarf, you know, that's why she matters. And that really just disallows our community of celebrating the true, you know, just the sheer amount of potential and incredible women that we have just within the Muslim American community, because we're so focused on making sure that there's only one in each field. And if there's only one, I mean, that's really boring, let's be honest. It's more fun when there's competition and people are, you know, out working with one another. I'm the oldest of 8, so we had a lot of alliances and enemies when we were growing up, but, you know, plurality is more fun.
And also, as you say, she tried to widen the narrative,
Yeah.
but the media will choose a certain story, and you can't always control that. And I think the other thing that's so important now, which goes back to the scarcity of images, the politics of scarcity, is it would be so great to have so many you know, to have the knowledge of all the different Muslims, or Native Americans, or whatever it is that you're talking about, minority groups, or majority minority groups, who are achieving in different sectors. Because if our children and our young people don't see that diversity, don't have it called out to them, then we don't know. And that's the same for a queer or trans community. It's the same for any community that is not routinely represented. So I really love the way that your piece drew that out. We're going to open for contributions and questions from the floor, and Asha is going to be the Olympic runner today, the first Olympic runner. Anyone? Oh, and then, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm completely new to modest fashion, so I've been to kind of one modest fashion show, short thing, but that is, so I'm learning a lot. I usually work on Islamic finance, and I think it's really quite interesting to learn more about other Islamic economies, and also some of the kind of similar and different dynamics. So this kind of question of mainstreaming, the importance of big conventional players carrying the market forward, and so on. But my question is, like, in Islamic finance now, the debate is kind of, okay, now we have kind of replicate most of the conventional financial products, you can get your Islamic mortgage and so on, but the kind of realization, so we have Sharia compliant products, but we don't necessarily realize the social justice objectives of Islam. And so I was wondering if similar conversations are also being had in modest fashion. So I mean, I don't know anything about fashion, as you can probably tell. But I think like two things I was thinking about. One is the kind of like gendered pricing of fashion products. So women usually pay, what is it, 20% or whatever more for a t-shirt. It's just a t-shirt and so on, but just because women are women, they pay more. And the other is the kind of question of sustainable supply chains in the garment industry. So are those things that are also debated in modest fashion circles, or is it other things that are kind of like, you talked briefly about social justice, so where's social justice coming into modest fashion?
So within the circle of modest fashion creators and bloggers that I have the privilege of listening in on and being a part of, the idea of ethical products and products that are created with ethical supplies has only just started. And you know, when it has started for certain individuals, it's very adamantly continued by those individuals. But the reality is that right now, since it's such a new market, a complaint that I've heard time and again from some designers is that other designers and creators within the Muslim modest fashion market create products that are not long-lasting or high quality because of the fact that they know that the consumer is willing to lay down the big bucks for products simply because it looks nice and fits within those parameters. So it's still definitely it hasn't matured to that point where we can safely say that, you know, people are having the conversations about those very topics that you're bringing up.
Thank you so much for bringing that up and the connection to finance, because it's very interesting how the Islamic marketing, Muslim marketing and Islamic branding initially started with food, with halal certification schemes, and with finance. And I was saying fashion is going to be the third F, and sure enough, the marketers now have turned to that. And I think what we're not going to see in fashion is a halal certification scheme, because what we keep hearing is there are too many different styles and interpretations. You will find someone who will write one for you. You know, I guarantee you there's people out there that'll tell you this is what it is, and this is how it should be. But in terms of the market, that's not going to fly. I think your point about the social justice agenda, I would say it's been developing for quite a long time in the modest fashion sector across the faiths. Many brands that start off as small brands don't have enough scale to fully control their supply chain. And I think also, and this is true across the sustainable fashion sector altogether, there is no position of moral purity. So you might know where your cloth is manufactured, you might be making sure that you're using factories with fair wage conditions for their laborers, but you don't know where the thread got made, or you didn't control the buttons, or the zipper, or, you know, so there is no position of real moral purity on that yet. But a number of the smaller brands are trying to work with local factories so they can see how things are made, and designing for quality, which I think we'll be coming on to in our final session with Mimi Maxi, with, you know, clothes designed to last. But it is an issue, and I think it's interesting that it often comes up in relation to fashion, because personally I have a bit of a bugbear that the sustainability agenda is often attached to fashion. I think because women are often seen as consumers of the frivolous and the luxury and the non-essential. But people don't say, what about the smartphones? What about the cars? What about the fabric in your cars, guys? Where did that come from? What wars in Africa are you supporting with the minerals that make up your computers? So fashion is a soft target in some ways, and at the same time, many fashion consumers are highly motivated. And so I think it's also the consumers that are asking that of the brands as well. You had. Did you? There.
So many things to say and ask, like how can we contain it? I loved your point about the first hijab. I honestly never thought about it like that before, that there are so many other Muslim women that are doing perhaps similar things but not getting the recognition. I wanted to ask you about the question of capitalism. You're saying that mainstream markets now have taken notice of this highly lucrative yet underserved market, and they want to capitalize on it, and that we, the Muslims, we are the ones that should be occupying that space. Now that's why you said what Noor Tijuri did in her article of accepting the Playboy interview, that was quite fine, because again she's occupying that space. And I agree with the concept that the visibility, right? I mean, the average person looking through Playboy is now going to learn something about hijab. But when you look at the history of Playboy and the fact that 2014, a porn artist, a Lebanese American porn artist by the name of
Mia Khalifa.
Yes, Mia Khalifa she performed the porn in a full hijab, and Pornhub.com said that this was the most watched pornography video that they've ever had. Again, it's rooted in them capitalizing on the idea of the hijab, but then again, also rooted in this fetishization of the Muslim women. So my question to you is, at what cost do we kind of allow ourselves to be visible in every single space, even one that is completely kind of at odds with what we represent, right?
I mean, porn is a kind of awkward.
Wait for the microphone.
I can say it again for the podcast. Thanks for your question. And like I said, porn is kind of at odds with probably every woman and man. So, and actually we covered Mia Khalifa on The Tempest, which is my platform, and the writer, she took the devil's advocate position, which might interest you. She actually said that, why don't we, and I'm not necessarily saying I'm agreeing with this, I just found it hilarious and fascinating, and a lot of people got really angry. She said, don't you think it's interesting that finally Muslim women, hijabi women, are being fetishized again in porn? Doesn't that mean that we're now going towards being accepted in mainstream American media? And I thought that was really an interesting perspective to take on it. Not agreeing with it, but it's that understanding that we ultimately do live in a society where supply and demand determines so much of our decisions and so much of our opportunities that are available to us, right? And you will be surprised. I mean, yes, that video was the top video on Pornhub, but hijab porn, jihad porn, niqabi porn, those are all extremely high watched categories, because there is an inherent fetishization of Muslim women, especially women who wear the headscarf. And I was 16 and on a bus, and this man sat next to me, and he sat for maybe 20 minutes trying to fetishize me until the bus driver kicked him off. So, I mean, it's been around for a while. When it comes to the Taguri decision, I'm not saying that I agree with with her doing it. I'm simply stating that it was done, and people flipping through Playboy,